talking about the things of God because of truth and the biblical worldview.
The U.S. Constitution obligates our government to preserve and protect the rights that our founders recognize come from God, our Creator, not our government. I believe that Scripture in the Bible is very clear that God is the one that raised up each of you, and God has allowed us to be brought here to this specific moment in time.
This is Jenna Ellis in the morning.
Good morning. Good morning. It is Wednesday, January 22nd, and you would think that this was January 22nd, like 3 years from now, with all of the accomplishments that Donald Trump has already made in his first a little over 24 hours in office, so much more than Joe Biden. But, you know, he's actually competent, which is something that America hasn't experienced over the last 4 years. And what a difference already. And so a slew of executive orders, and we're going to be talking about specifically the one on Birthright citizenship a little later on in the program with one of my favorite guests who is a lawyer. But first of all, I want to welcome in former Representative and Congressman Bob Good, who was the chair of the Freedom Caucus, to talk about the priorities for the new Congress, because with this slew of executive orders, really good thing to repeal a lot of the damage that Biden has done and all of that. But the onus is on Congress to actually codify a lot of this and put it into legislation so that it can't be so easily overturned. So good morning, Bob Good. And what should the priorities for this new Congress be?
Good morning, Jenna. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me again. You know, Jen, as I've said many times, it's all about the money when it comes to Congress, when it comes to the House in particular, which is constitutionally entrusted to protect the nation's finances, to effectively, adequately fund the government, protect our ability to borrow when necessary, to protect our credit rating, to meet our obligations. And as others have said, famously, that show me your checkbook, I'll show you your priorities. What do we fund? And as we move into the first 100 days here with the new president and the new Senate, obviously combined with the House majority, what will be our funding priorities and what will be the willingness of the Republican House and the Congress as a whole to address our nation's fiscal situation, to cut our spending, to shrink government, to not raise the debt limit without commensurate cuts in spending and fiscal reforms to put us on a path to fiscal stability, quite frankly. We are facing a fiscal crisis. You know, we've got over $36 trillion in debt now. We've got about $1 trillion a year in interest payments. Interest rates are going up now as a result. Our debt is harder to sell as a result. So we have this window of opportunity, Republicans do, where we can no longer blame Democrats, where we have got to deal with as I've said many times, the top two threats to the country coming out of the Biden administration were the border invasion and the debt. So President Trump is taking action on the border. Hopefully the House and the Senate will join him in passing legislation to address it, to codify into law the great policies he had from 8 years ago that he's implementing again now so that a future president can't reverse them. But are we willing to make the hard and difficult choices to cut the spending, to follow the recommendations of DOGE under the leadership of Elon Musk, and actually do what the American people elected us to do from a fiscal standpoint?
Yeah, and fiscal responsibility and, of course, making sure that the economy is better overall for the American people, and that includes inflation reduction and in just ensuring that things are affordable again, and there's more money that people can spend from their own income, and so reduction, of course, overall in taxes. A lot of people are talking about potentially with this new external revenue service. Well, how about the internal revenue service that a lot of us have to deal with? Why don't we reduce the federal income tax? You know, some of those priorities. What do you see in terms of Congress being able to, or even being willing to, probably is the better question, on some of these economic priorities that would affect the American people, just so that we have more of our own income to save and to spend?
Well, you did a great job of tying together those issues that are impacted by the fiscal policies in Washington and the inflation being at the top of the list. President Trump's going to do a great job, is doing a great job addressing the energy portion of it. As you know, energy costs impact everything that's from the utility bills to grocery prices, because everything's shipped via petroleum products and so forth, to what we pay at the gas pump. But the inflationary spending or the reckless excessive spending is what's caused the inflation that's hurting the American people, where the average cost of everything's up about 30% from what it was 4 years ago. The regulatory burden that President Trump did such a great job in reducing regulation, 7 or 8 rescissions of regulations for every new one that he implemented during his 4 years. Biden did just the opposite. That's the hidden tax, the hidden cost that's hurting Americans so much, thousands of dollars a year. The average family is paying tens of thousands of dollars a year, really, from the Biden regulatory burden that Trump will be reversing, I'm confident. But it is the spending, the dollars, too many dollars chasing too few goods, that's causing the oversupply of cash, that's causing the cost of things to go up, went up over the past 4 years. And while inflation slowed towards the end of the Biden term, still that inflation was stacked on top of previous inflation. So again, things are 20, 30% higher than they were when he got in office. So Republicans have got to show the willingness in these reconciliation, whether it's one bill or two bills, because that's where you have the mechanism that you don't have to have the 60 votes in the Senate when Republicans only have 54 senators, so they can pass out a reconciliation, things that have a fiscal impact. And Jody Arrington, the Budget Committee, the House Freedom Caucus, led by Chip Roy and Scott Perry and Andy Harris and Andy Biggs, they've proposed just trillions of dollars of cuts together, working with the budget chair, again, Jody Arrington, to put the nation on a path to fiscal stability. And Republicans just have to show the resolve. What we need to see for once, Jenna, is instead of pressuring conservatives to go along with spending increases and betraying our principles, we need pressure on the moderates to take advantage of the moment, to rise to meet the moment, and do what we told the American people we would do: cut our spending, reduce our deficit, begin to chip away at our national debt as we grow the economy with Trump's pro-growth policies together, increase the revenue through his pro-growth policies and tax cuts, but that's got to be offset by spending cuts as well.
And I'm speaking with Bob Good, who is the former chair of the Freedom Caucus and congressman. And you mentioned the Freedom Caucus, like Chip Roy and some of these others that have been excellent advocates for fiscal responsibility. And that is one of the 7 priorities of Speaker Johnson on his own website. And yet we've seen some of these omnibus bills and other things that he's brought to the floor that, frankly, have concerned conservatives in terms of his priorities leading the whole conference. Do you think now, with Donald Trump back in office and the Republican trifecta, we're going to see a little bit of a shift in back to perhaps what Mike Johnson's priorities, at least still on his website, appear to be?
Yes, we need Mike Johnson's stated priorities, not his unfortunate record of priorities over the past 15 months or so since he became Speaker. To your point, while he has been a verbal conservative for all of his political life, there were 7 major spending bills during his first 14 months as Speaker through the end of 23 and all of 24. 7 major spending bills, whether they were omnibuses or minibuses or CRs, continuing resolutions. Every single one passed with about 200 Democrat votes, far more Democrat votes than Republican votes. They kept spending, either increased spending or kept spending at the Democrat levels, kept the Democrat policies in place, borrowed more money for the Social Security Fairness Act, as it was called, $300 billion more, or the $100 billion to go to Biden's FEMA. All of that passed with predominantly Democrat votes, which made our debt situation worse. Hopefully John Thune and the new Republican Senate, President Trump and Russ Vought, his new budget director, who's excellent, combined with the conservatives in the House, will persuade Johnson to be a partner in that and pressuring the moderates to go along with spending cuts, reducing government, again, putting us back on a path towards fiscal stability.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right to characterize it as a disparity between his stated priorities versus the active actions that he's taken as Speaker. You were there throughout his initial tenure as Speaker. I've known him well for years, and frankly was surprised to see that disparity. What do you attribute that to? I mean, is it just a lack of being able to whip the moderates? Is it kind of just more of the, hey, I'm willing to bring whatever the entire Congress as a whole wants to bring, and not really just be a leader for my conference looking at the Congress as a whole? Or, what's really going on in the background?
Well, the Congress reflects the American people in whom we elect and re-elect to represent us. And the American people need to elect courageous conservatives of principle who will do the right thing and not keep re-electing the people who betray us. But so the Congress reflects the people, and then the Speaker reflects the Congress. And so, unfortunately, you've got tremendous difficulty in getting a true, courageous conservative warrior elected as Speaker. So you're compromising and you're making sort of the best of the possible options. And Mike Johnson, when he became Speaker, had the least amount of opposition. He was trusted and respected across the conference as a stated conservative, kind of a backbench, a secondary leader who hadn't shown a lot of courage and a lot of toughness and a lot of fight, but he was given the opportunity where the hope was that, he would rise to the moment, that he would, that we'd be able to sort of buck him up and encourage and support him, and he'd be willing to show some fight. And frankly, he failed us miserably. I think some of it was fear of doing nothing was worse than his fear of doing the wrong thing. I think he was persuaded by the D.C. swamp cartel, the intelligence community, which persuaded him to change his position on FISA surveillance and a warrant requirement, the defense community that changed his mind on Ukraine and funding for Ukraine when he promised he wouldn't do that. And then he kept promising, okay, we'll fight next time. We can't allow the government to shut down. Fear of a government shutdown, that he would get blamed for it. And so he was willing to do what Democrats wanted, to keep the government open, to keep funding the very things that we were running against, all of which were disastrous failures, an unwillingness to walk away and say no and use leverage to force the Democrats to the negotiating table. And time again, we surrendered to what the Democrats wanted to do. I think President Trump will help him. I think a Republican Senate will help him. But the fight is coming, Jenna, on whether or not you're going to see the pressure on the conservatives to betray their principles and to go along with spending increases and a failure to reduce government, reduce spending, or is there going to be a fight to force the moderates, those in the swing districts, so to speak, the majority makers, so to speak, to actually make the tough choices, take the tough votes, and capitalize on the opportunity the American people have given us to cut our spending, reduce our government, rein in the reckless deficit and debt situation. If we don't do it now, not just in these 4 years, we may not have control in 2 years. If we don't do it in this first year is critically important. These first few months are critically important because next year you get to an election year. Now's the opportunity to do it. It's got to be a priority right now.
Yeah, so well said. And Bob Good, it strikes me as so frustrating, frankly, as a conservative, that when Democrats are in control, Republicans say, well, we're the minority party. We can't really do anything except, kind of oppose and go on media hits and write strongly worded letters. But, we can't really do anything. And then when Republicans have the majority, as they do, again, in Trump's first 2 years, like they did in the first 2 years of his first term, then they somehow say, oh, well, we have to capitulate to the Democrats who are in the minority because, we can't, whatever their reason is. It's like they don't just say, but because we have to reach across the aisle and, all this nonsense, instead of saying, look, they're in the minority. The American people overwhelmingly rejected their values and lack thereof and their policy stances and all of that. And so instead of just marginalizing them and moving forward with the mandate of the American people, it seems like they always have to be bipartisan in everything instead of just doing what the American people elected them to do. That's really frustrating. Why can't Republicans just have the backbone and the spine to ignore the Democrats, ignore the media, and just do the business of implementing the America First agenda?
Well said, Jenna. And you're right. When Democrats have control, they exercise that power without apology. and ram through their agenda as they did during the first 2 years of Biden administration, had total control. And then they knew that Republicans in the House wouldn't reverse anything, wouldn't be willing to take risks and to show courage and shut down the government if necessary to reverse these policies and spending levels. So Republicans need to show that same resolve. The one thing that gives me hope, history is not a good indicator. Your point is well made. History does not indicate Republicans will show the toughness, the resolve, the courage to do the right thing. But what I think might be different this time, if President Trump and Elon Musk, with the Doge recommendations and with the tremendous power he has to influence public opinion, to bring attention, if they will get behind and say, you know what, Republicans that don't join us, we're going to primary you, we're going to defeat you at the ballot box, we're going to spend money to vote you out of office unless you get in line and do Republican stuff. That is what could be different this time, where we name and shame the Republicans that won't join us in cutting spending and making the tough choices and putting the reforms in place that will end this massive explosion of debt that American people are suffering under. That is compromising the future for our kids and our grandkids. Every dollar we spend right now is a tax, an increased tax, an increased debt, or a result of inflationary impact on the American people. There's no free lunch and spending without consequence. Those days are over. And so we need President Trump to put pressure, Elon Musk to put pressure on Republicans who don't go along and do Republican stuff.
Well said. Name them and shame them. And that is called accountability. And that's what we as the American people, as the voters, as the citizens, as responsible for our government and having the power through our U.S. Constitution to hold them accountable, we need to actually do that. And that's what I love doing on this show each and every morning, is not just saying, okay, well, they have an R after their name, so, therefore we're going to agree with them, or they say they're a conservative, therefore we agree with them. They say they're a Christian, therefore we agree with them. Or the opposite side, they have a D, so we're going to oppose them at every turn. No, it all comes back to the principles of our founding in our Constitution, which of course is built upon a biblical worldview. So we have to hold our elected officials accountable at every level. So Bob Good, really appreciate your time. You can follow him on X at @RepBobGood, and we'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis in the Morning.
This is Abraham Hamilton III with AFR, and we're sending Bibles. Here's Michael with Bible League International.
Abraham, I know our hearts and prayers are with those affected by the Israeli conflict in the Middle East. Here's a great need right now in that part of the world. Nora is a born-again believer. She's a widowed mother of 4. Her husband was killed by a terrorist cell, and one day radicals showed up and burned her house down, nearly killing Nora and her 4 daughters, the youngest of which 4 years of age, maimed for life with very serious burns. Now, her crime is, number 1, she's a born-again believer. Number 2, she was found to be educating her daughters beyond the age of 8. In that system, that is a serious violation. But I can tell you, rather than grow bitter, Nora has introduced about 50 Arabic-speaking women to Christ. They need Bibles in the Middle East. We want to bless 16,000 Bibleless believers. You've done it for 12,000, 4,000 to go. By January 31st, $5 sends a Bible, $100 sends 20. Abe?
You can give by calling 800-YES-WORD, 800-YES-WORD, or visit sendbiblesnow.org. That's sendbiblesnow.org.
Maybe you can relate to this. A lot of people can. They feel like their health care costs are just out of control. And if you're 65 or older, there's actually some great news about this. You can sign up for MediShare 65 Plus and save big in the new year. MediShare 65 Plus is a healthcare bill sharing community. It's trusted, it's faith-based, and it's saving people like you thousands on medical expenses. If you have Medicare Parts A and B, out-of-pocket expenses add up fast, but this gets things back under control and gives you peace of mind too. With one low monthly price, saves you so much, and it's easy. You can use any Medicare approved doctor. So find out why so many seniors are absolutely raving about MediShare 65 Plus. It's very different in a wonderful way. It's actually refreshing. They even offer to pray with you each time you call. Call now and find out more. It's 833-45-BIBLE. That's 833-45-BIBLE, 833-45-BIBLE.
Hello, Americans. I'm Todd Stern. Stand by for news and commentary next. After a full day of pomp and pageantry and parties, most America First conservatives settled in for an early night, but not President Trump. The commander-in-chief went directly to work, signing hundreds of executive orders in the Oval Office. The president held an impromptu press conference, answering questions for nearly an hour while not missing a beat. Trump promised to hit the ground running, but we didn't realize it was going to be a full-blown sprint. He delivered 3 historic speeches, attended 3 inaugural balls, signed 42 executive orders, made 115 personnel decisions, enacted more than 200 executive actions, and pardoned nearly all of the J6 political prisoners. President Trump also declared in the United States there are only 2 genders, male and female, as God intended. Oh, and the president also capped off the night by dancing to a rendition of YMCA while wielding a saber. Trump did more on his first day in office than Biden accomplished during his entire 4 years in the White House. I'm Todd Stearns.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back, and let's welcome in my next guest, who's a very dear friend, and I always love having her on the program, Penny Nance. She is the CEO of Concerned Women for America. And Penny, before we get to our main topic this morning, I just want to ask you your overall thoughts on President Trump getting a second term and this explosive, first 24 hours that he's gotten so much done. I think a lot of conservatives and Christians are very excited, are very hopeful going into the next 4 years. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would say we, of course, are so excited. Concerned Women for America and our She Prays, She Votes initiative made 35 million voter contacts. Our young women traveled 10,000 miles on a bright pink bus going to the key battleground states. We spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania. We did 150 road signs by churches that reminded people to vote. It said things like God created them male and female. Stand up and stand up, protect your daughters and vote. And just, anything we could think of to really make sure we leaned in to the demographic that really need to turn out. And that was Christian voters, and in our opinion, really low propensity Christian women. We bought data of about 100,000, again, in about 18 battleground states and key counties, women who had only voted once in the last 4 elections, and leaned in and contacted them to directly, real people, and asked them to vote. And so I think that, plus all the prayers of people who realized our country is going in the wrong direction. And I don't just mean a little bit. I mean perhaps going off the cliff. And that was my sense, frankly. When you get to the point where you don't even know the difference between male and female, and you're using tax dollars to do surgeries on little children, to change their sex and harm them for life, something is very wrong. And so I think we're righting some of the wrongs, we're turning back around, but really what we all have to do is turn to the Lord. We love Donald Trump. He's not perfect. He's an imperfect man, and he's going to need our prayers, as are all the people that he brings with him into the administration. I know many of them. I love Pam Bondi and many of the people that are coming along, and they are going to work very hard. I think they're very well intentioned, but they're going to be in a battle against, and dare I say it, the deep state people who are in government, who do not share their views, who do not want them to succeed. And it's just going to be a very real battle to even be able to reduce the size of the bureaucracy that's inert, that doesn't want to change, doesn't want to go into the office even. And they're really going to have their work cut out for them. And, of course, there's a media who's watching every single thing, and we've already seen some of that. So we need to pray.
Absolutely. And I think that is the best encouragement for certainly our audience here at the American Family Radio Network. And I'm reminded of 1 Timothy 2:1-2 that says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. And I don't know about you, Penny, but especially with everything that this nation has been through over the last 4 years, I am praying for peaceful and quiet lives, that we don't have to have all of the strife and contention and concern that we've had over the last 4 years. And so this is why we need to pray for our leaders, regardless of whether we voted for them, agree with them, or not. We all prayed for Biden as well over the last 4 years. So that's a great encouragement. And I want to ask you about the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, which has had kind of a long and complex history. But in the last dwindling days of the Biden administration, he made this just declaration on social media saying, we now acknowledge that this is the 28th Amendment. It's part of the Constitution. And then Kamala Harris and a lot of the Democrat leftists, of course, mainly women, are suggesting that this amendment actually got ratified when the history shows that the ERA had an expired deadline and was not actually ratified. The National Archives agreed with that and said, no, this didn't go through the proper constitutional amendment ratification process. So what are the Democrats even trying to do with suggesting this?
Well, that's, there's been many times in the past 4 years in which I've worried about the mental acuity of President Biden, and this is one of them. That is completely divorced from reality, what he said. It is provably false. What happened over the years, and again, this is part of Concerned Women for America's history, actually. This is the issue that brought Beverly LaHaye, a young pastor's wife from California, into politics. She realized that there's this thing that sounded good, the Equal Rights Amendment, that promised equal protection for women and under law, and it was really this panacea of things that were going to happen that were going to protect women. But once she delved into it, she realized, wait a minute, this isn't at all what it sounds like. In fact, it would break down any distinctions in law between men and women. So that means there could be no limits on abortion in any state that had prohibitions in place, that had parental notification laws, that had anything at all. Those would go away on day one. And it's not a law. It's actually a literal amendment to the Constitution that would be very, very difficult to ever undo once it was landed. It would do the things that we are fighting right now that we find so reprehensible, and which the people of America specifically pushed back on in this last election. And according to our exit polls, it was a 70-30 issue of people saying there are only two genders. We cannot have men and women's restrooms in our locker rooms, on our daughters' sports teams, in their dorm rooms, even in women's prisons and domestic violence shelters. If the Equal Rights Amendment had passed, all those things that we're fighting today would have come to pass back in 1982. And so it didn't, because not enough states passed it in time by the deadline. And which is the last deadline. The extended deadline was June 30, 1982. The original one, I believe, was 1979. And then what the other thing that occurred that they are in denial about is not only did not enough states join in time, but if they're going to count the states that joined later, they have to count the states that left. And so you had, I think it was like, I don't know the specific number, I think it was like 5 states that actually came up. They went ahead and ratified the ERA. But then women like Beverly LaHaye and Phyllis Schlafly, another, great matriarch that's passed on to heaven now, was in Illinois. and alerting women like, wait, do you understand what this means? And they said, no, we didn't understand what it meant, but we don't like that, and we don't want to do that. And so they came off. They backed out of the ratification. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think this is really sums it up of where we are and the reality of the situation in 2020 before she died. The great lioness of the law, the leftist hero on the court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said publicly, they have to start over. If this is what they want, then legally, as much as she didn't like it, you have to start over. And so she was honest. She dealt with the reality of the situation, and that is true. If they want this to happen, they're going to have to start over. The deadline passed. They didn't. They're short 3 states, and several others came off. So it did not pass. And our national archivist, as you mentioned, Colleen Shogan, has said very specifically that in the U.S. it is not counted as a ratified amendment to the Constitution. That is absolutely incorrect. And Joe Biden was lying, basically. There's no other way to explain it.
Yeah, and I so appreciate that history. Penny Nance, my special guest this morning, who's the CEO of Concerned Women for America. You can follow them at CW4A on X, and also Penny Nance at PY Nance. And yet we have all of these leftist women who are, at least I think, more cognitively there than Joe Biden, who took that lie and ran with it and said, oh, yeah, this is, and we need this for equality and so forth. And the actual, language of the amendment says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And of course, that term sex now doesn't just mean the literal difference between men and women to the left anymore. This includes sexual orientation, gender identity, all of the LGBTQ nonsense, which I think is a huge reason that the left is pushing for this. But do you anticipate that they're going to actually raise any sort of legal challenges when, as you mentioned, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's kind of the venerated patron saint of the law for the left, even said, no, you've got to start over.
Yeah, I don't think the court would be a good use of their money in lawsuit, but I would love to ask them, what do you think you're going to get for this? What would you, if you did make this an amendment to the Constitution, what right would you have that you don't have now? What new right would be available to you? And I think the answer would be, there would be no ability for states to say we're not going to fund transgender surgeries for minors, and we're only going to have women on our women's sports teams, and all the other things I mentioned. The unique dignity of women is a principle from the book of Genesis. God created them male and female. And it was the early feminists who recognized there need to be distinctions, that women need to be able to own property. And we've been discriminated against because we are made in God's image, and we're image bearers of Christ, but we also need our safe spaces and the little bit of set-asides in businesses and things like that, and any bit of, and the very little bit of help that we get as far as our sports teams being able to have equal money, which was Title IX. Title IX passed and in the 70s because women, all the money in schools would go for male sports teams, and they didn't have any left over for the women's sports teams. Well, it was all tax dollars. There was no reason for that. And so it was the Democrats that passed Title IX saying we can't discriminate in education against women. They have to have the ability to have their own sports teams and to have their own dorm rooms and to have safety and security. And they need to be, Title IX also encompasses the ability to be safe as far as sexual harassment and all of that. And so it was Patsy Mink, who was a Democrat from Hawaii, who led that effort. And now, if this happened, if the ERA passed, it would break down Title IX. So it takes women backwards is the bottom line. The question is, what does it get you? No, the truth is, what does it lose you? It loses you your unique dignity, the respect for what women deserve, what we value because of how God created us, and we should demand no less.
Absolutely. So well said. And this is where the biblical worldview is always the best foundation for law and policy, because it recognizes that human dignity and that we are each made in the image of God, and also the difference that we are uniquely made, male and female, not just assigned at birth, but that God has created us intentionally with a specific gender that is immutable. We can't change that. And you can just bet, Penny Nance, that the left is going to continue to push this. They may even try to start this again, or in future years with a different Congress, try to raise the ERA again. This is why the work that Concern Women for America does is incredibly important, why what AFA Action does is incredibly important, to teach this truth so that we can reject policy that is built on a false premise. So, Penny Nance, really appreciate the history of the ERA, all the work that you do. We'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis in the Morning.
We're going to dig a little deeper into the verse we started with, Matthew 6:24 and a few others. We cannot serve God and money. That generosity is a key piece of this as well. I think about what Ron Blue, the author, says often, and that is that giving actually loosens the grip that money can have over our lives.
Faith and Finance with Rob West, weekdays at 9 a.m. Central or on the AFR app.
We don't have to be like the 10 that said it can't be done, it's too big, the giants are too big. We need to be like Joshua and Caleb and say, you know what, there are giants. This is a massive problem. When you have a nation that is ignorant of the principles that produce a free society, start where you can. It's the only way I know. It's a little bit at a time.
Join Walker Wildman and Rick Green as they tackle today's issues from a biblical and a constitutional perspective. At the Core, 1 p.m. Central weekdays on AFR.
The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. My name is Abraham Hamilton III, and this is the Hamilton Minute. With the tragic LA area fires, a convenient refrain has been employed repeatedly as the cause: climate change. But a closer look at meteorology, history, and land management show that this claim is one made by low-information journalists and fails to address more immediate likely causes. The U.S. Geological Survey shows wildfires in Southern California aren't a new or surprising phenomenon. The reality is that poor land management, accidental ignition, and even arson frequently spark events like this. But to acknowledge that would require questioning regressive orthodoxy, which is, of course, sacrosanct.
Listen each weekday from 5 to 6 p.m. Central for the Hamilton Corner with Abraham Hamilton III, Public Policy Analyst for the American Family Association.
Director of the AFA Foundation, Riley Wildman.
I've traveled a lot. I've met with people from all over the country.
Riley has served as the director of the AFA Foundation for over a decade.
The most rewarding thing about my job is that we get to build relationships through our donors and our supporters and get to have that personal relationship with them.
Contact the AFA Foundation today to learn how you can shore up permanent income for your retirement years while supporting the culture-transforming work of the American Family Association. A charitable gift annuity benefits you and helps ensure the AFA will impact America for generations to come. Call 800-326-4543, extension 345. That's 800-326-4543, extension 345. The AFA Foundation, the financial stewardship division of the American Family Association.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. Well, 22 states' attorneys general have sued already President Donald Trump to block his executive order and his move to end a century-old immigration practice known as Birthright Citizenship. This coming from the AP, guaranteeing that U.S.-born children are citizens regardless of their parents' status. Note they don't include the word illegal in there, and that's really going to be the subject of controversy. But going on with the AP, they say Trump's roughly 700-word executive order issued late Monday amounts to a fulfillment of something he's talked about during the presidential campaign, but whether it succeeds is far from certain amid what is likely to be a lengthy legal battle over the president's immigration policies and a constitutional right to citizenship. Of course, they're talking about the 14th Amendment and the issue of birthright citizenship for children born in the U.S., including to, of course, illegal immigrants, and that is primarily the thrust of the executive order. And the legal debate really hinges on the citizenship clause, as it's known, which states, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Unquote. So let's welcome in Gerard Folletti, who is founder of the Lawfare Project. And Gerard, what do you think about the constitutionality and the likelihood of success for this executive order?
I think this is an executive order that will absolutely make it up to the Supreme Court at least once, probably twice, before we finally know whether this is constitutional. It's a very novel approach, but not one that's that unusual. When you think about it, it's up to the courts to determine what the language of the Constitution means in this case. And the last time they looked at this was really the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s. And even that case that basically affirmed that people born in the U.S. are citizens, that was fact-specific. That turned on the fact that the person's parents were legally in the United States. So this is a very novel argument that hasn't been tried in a very long time, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and you're talking about, for those who are, interested in their wonks, kind of like we are, you can look up that case. It's United States versus Wong Kim Ark from 1898. So this was after the 14th Amendment was ratified. But you're absolutely right, Gerard Folletti, that the facts of that case were whether or not this child was a citizen born to parents that were Chinese and Chinese citizens, but were in the United States legally. And I don't think that the founders, the original drafters of the Constitution, or the framers of the 14th Amendment, which was part of the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War, ever intended that anyone who broke the law in order to come to America or be present in the United States, and then what we term as anchor babies, basically to have a child physically present in the United States in order to then capitalize on their citizenship and then somehow create a pathway for themselves to obtain legal citizenship, was ever contemplated. I mean, I think that's clearly outside the intent of the Constitution as a whole, including the 14th Amendment. So as these legal arguments will be challenged, where do you think this ultimately ends up at the U.S. Supreme Court with the current composition of the court?
I think that with the current composition of the court, and bear in mind, it's not about how conservative or liberal the justices are. It's about their methodology in interpreting the Constitution. And what we've seen over the last 20 years, the Roberts Court essentially is that they look at the circumstances, at what was going on at the time that laws or constitutional amendments were written in order to consider how to interpret them. And when you could look at it that way, I think that what you will see is that this executive order will ultimately be upheld. As you just said, the 14th Amendment was written essentially to make sure that formerly enslaved people were granted citizenship. That was ratifying what was already happening in the United States. It wasn't contemplating illegal people coming to the country illegally and then their children getting citizenship. So the context of the 14th Amendment, the history of the 14th Amendment, combined with the language and how it's been interpreted over the years, including by the Supreme Court, I think that ultimately this court will find that Trump's executive order is constitutional.
And do you think, and I agree with that analysis, do you think that Trump's executive order was crafted specifically contemplating some of these legal challenges and putting the best framework forward in order to get to ultimately that which you and I would agree would be the correct interpretation of the law and the Constitution as written.
I think it was. I think that this was crafted in a very narrowly tailored way, not going over broad in order to raise other challenges. So I think the way that this order is written, actually, this is the ultimate issue that will be decided, and it's very well written. I give credit to his staff for writing it. I think it is a masterpiece of simplicity because it doesn't go too far. At the same time, it's also a political issue. It's about Donald Trump selling to the American public that this is not meant to disenfranchise people, because literally what that means is give people losing the right to vote because those people don't have the right to vote in the first place. People who are here illegally should not be benefiting from the privileges of citizenship. And I think if he makes that argument as well as with this order, you will have more support for it, and I think courts will be inclined to rule correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, the Constitution and the rights that it protects are for American citizens. It doesn't protect, our country doesn't protect rights for those who are excluded from our jurisdiction. And this is why that phrase, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, is also contested, and another argument in furtherance of President Trump's executive order to say that people who are here illegally really aren't part of, they haven't submitted formally to our jurisdiction in terms of becoming naturalized or even entering legally. I mean, even like somebody on a tourist visa, or someone, for example, like the parents in Wong Kim Ark, the case back in 1898. I mean, they're literally here, and their very first act is breaking the law of our national sovereignty. And so why should they benefit in any way, shape, or form from protections of rights that are bestowed on Americans by virtue of our system of government? And so all of this, it really makes sense. And yet you have now these 22 attorneys general from, of course, blue states that are arguing, you know, how could you disenfranchise? I mean, that's their favorite word. Disenfranchise any of these poor immigrants who are just coming to make a better life in America, blah, 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 you know, tears, whatever. When there's no right to begin with that can be disenfranchised. I mean, it's they're assuming that a right is in place that's being infringed upon, when the very question is whether that right is held by illegal immigrants.
Well, the reason they love using disenfranchised is, when you think about it, a lot of progressive states and cities have actually passed laws allowing illegal immigrants to vote in local elections, which is really a perversion when you think about it, because you're giving them a status that they should not be entitled to. They have never submitted to the jurisdiction of the United States. When you're here illegally, it means you're hiding from the jurisdiction of the United States. You're not submitting to it. Otherwise, you'd have gone through the process. You'd have done it properly. So I think it's very interesting to see the language that the left uses, the progressive part of our country uses, to make it seem like we are taking away something that exists when, in fact, this never existed in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely well said. And so could there be, while this challenge is making its way up to ultimately likely the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's going to take a while, could Congress legislate using their power in Article 1, Section 8, and providing, you know, they have the power over a uniform rule of immigration naturalization? Could they legislate according to the 14th Amendment to further clarify or define what birthright citizenship means, that would help this executive order have a preferred outcome, frankly, that, of course, conservatives prefer, that we're talking about? Would that help or assist? Do you think that would be possible?
Well, I think that if Congress gets involved, it'll just open this up to yet more challenges in the courts, because no matter what Congress does, it'll be, any law will be subject to the same 14th Amendment challenge, and you'll instantly see hundreds of lawsuits filed against that as well. If anything, it might actually delay the process a little bit. But ultimately, Congress can help. I think that if there is a bill that clarifies that people who are in this country illegally have no status, that citizenship is not something that is accorded to people who are not here with the consent of the government, that only helps. And that's the proper way to do it. You shouldn't be relying on the executive branch to issue executive orders interpreting the law. You should be relying on Congress to do its job and make the law and clarify what the law means. So ultimately, it should be for Congress to make these things clear. But then again, we run the risk in both cases with the executive order, we run the risk of it being changed by a future administration that is not Donald Trump. And with laws, we have the risk that they will be interpreted differently by an administration that's not Donald Trump, which is why ultimately we do want the Supreme Court to weigh in on this and uphold the constitutionality of this. Then it would be beneficial to have a law.
Yeah, so with that kind of limited time frame, I guess, if Congress doesn't have some kind of intervening legislation, do you think that we would get a conclusion to this legal challenge over the next 4 years, or is it possible that a future incoming president in 2028 would then just abandon the litigation at that point if there isn't a resolution yet?
I think it's likely that there will be a resolution by this in the next 2 years. I think this will get to the U.S. Supreme Court by then. And assuming that it rules as we expect, that this is constitutional, that this is a valid order, then the next step would be for Congress to codify it, to make this law so that it's not changed by an incoming administration. That process will also take some time, but if we keep the House and we keep the Senate, that is something that Donald Trump would be able to sign into law by the end of his term.
Yeah, I'm speaking with Gerard Folletti, who is the founder of the Lawfare Project, and you can follow him on X as well. And this raises the question of the importance of legislation instead of executive orders, which we've seen Donald Trump in signing those in the Capital One arena, and amidst a lot of fanfare and throwing of those Sharpie pens and all that into the audience. But what other issues have you seen that have been taken care of currently through executive order that Congress really should legislate on in the coming days, and especially over this first 2 years when they do have the trifecta, to ensure that they aren't just reversed by another future administration?
I hate to say it, but pretty much everything. I think that in the last 2 decades, we've seen Congress increasingly walking away from its role to write clear laws that are detailed and that lay out the intent of the voters as manifest through their election of these people into Congress. And they've left it to the executive branch to interpret very broadly written laws. So when Donald Trump issued, 200 executive orders on everything from the environment to economics to the border to DEI initiatives, you really need law to clarify and codify what he's doing, or else a future administration that is not Donald Trump can change it, just like Donald Trump wiped away a lot of the disasters we've seen from the last 4 years in a single day. So you really need Congress to start doing its job and making clear and detailed laws. So that is not, it's everything, Jenna. It's absolutely everything.
And this is why elections besides the President of the United States ultimately matter. This is why statewide elections matter, who we send to Congress, who even on the state and local level. I mean, there's so much that rightly should be the province of the state to govern and to set policy for. And if our government ultimately was working as intended, we would see Congress making those laws in furtherance of the intent of the U.S. Constitution, protecting and preserving the rights that are God-given, instead of just a lot of these executive orders, which, as we mentioned, it's really good that Trump rescinded a lot of the terrible things that Biden put in place, but we don't want to have another future administration just reverse everything of Trump's. And so this is why the whole of government matters, and why we need to be engaged at every level as concerned citizens and as Christians to ensure that our voice is heard and that we get the right people in office that actually will have a spine and stand up and legislate accordingly. So Gerard Folletti, we're already out of time, but I really appreciate your analysis on the birthright citizenship issue. I was watching Fox News yesterday, kind of unfortunately, but in the background, and John Roberts, who not the Supreme Court justice, but the reporter, an anchor was on there just talking to Tom Homan, basically just laughing at him, saying, of course this isn't going to go anywhere. And with all due respect to John Roberts, who I know personally and, like him, there is a legal question here. And I think it's a lot more complex than kind of this just, shoving off and laughing at it, saying, oh, this will never go anywhere. Don't underestimate Donald Trump. I think that's the lesson for all of us. You can always reach me and my team, Jenna at afr.net.
The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast may not necessarily reflect those of the American Family Association or American Family